So glad you're back in this wonderful facility, and I would love if Ms. Antoinette Washington, who is the Secretary of the Spiritual Assembly of Baha'i Faith in Nashville, would come down and do sort of an official welcome for Baha'i.
Good morning. To the planners, to the academic community, to any community-based groups, and any clergy that are present. We are delighted to have you in this building this morning. For many of you, the name Baha'i is a new name. So I'd like to just give you a quick little introduction so that you will see how important it is for us to have hosted you in this building. The Baha'i Faith is the world's newest independent global religion. The teachings of the Baha'i Faith inspires individuals and communities to work to improve the lives of all individuals and to contribute to an advancing civilization. Baha'is' belief address such essential themes as the oneness of God and religion, the oneness of humanity and freedom from prejudice, the inherent nobility of the human being, the fundamental equality of the sexes, the centrality of justice in all human endeavors, and the importance of education and the dynamics of the relationship that are to bind together individuals, communities, and institutions as humanity advances toward a collective maturity. The millions of Baha'is the world over represent all ethnicities, nationalities, tribes, ages, racial groups, religious backgrounds, economic and social classes. There is no clergy in the Baha'i faith. The spiritual and administrative affairs of the Baha'is in a given geographic area is managed by the spiritual assembly of that geographic area. Those 9 individuals that make up that body are elected by that geographic representation. The building that you find yourself in this morning is a sacred space that is open to all of humanity. It serves as a space where hearts of all those long for peace and harmony can gather and consult. We hope that your deliberations and reflections on the issues that you have identified will be illumined with love and respect for the diverse expressions that you experience here today. Again, welcome, and please enjoy yourselves.
Thank you, Ms. Washington. We're really honored to be able to assemble here in your facility. We're so very appreciative. Everyone in TBR, of course, knows Vice Chancellor for Academic Affairs, Dr. Tristan Denley.
Well, it's great to see everybody this morning, and I really want to echo the words to many thanks to the Baha'i community for hosting us today. It's a beautiful space, and I know we're looking forward to another wonderful day. I know that many of you were here yesterday and were able to really experience the extraordinary panels that we were able to hear from yesterday, and really focus on this idea of, as well as being a community of learning, that we are also a community that learns, and a community that learns together. So yesterday was a wonderful expression of that, and I'm looking forward to today being exactly the same, and also looking for ways for us to continue this work, because I think a lot of the energy in yesterday's room was how wonderful this project has been, but also looking for ways in which we might take those ideas and the spirit of this work and continuing it and also spreading it across our system. So ways in which we can look to do that. I'm very interested in finding out what those ways might be and partnering with those who would like to continue next time. So thank you.
So again, in the briefest form of introduction, Rick, to whatever extent you can get up Dr. Nancy Thomas overhead from us, I think the technology is together that we're going to be able to pull this off. You know, this is always iffy, as we all know, in all our classrooms. Dr. Nancy Thomas is the director at Tufts University in Boston of the Institute for Democracy in Higher Education. And she runs and directs nationally through Tufts and through its Circle Research Facility there, the National Study on Student Learning, Voting, and Engagement that I refer to by acronym NSOLVE. I'm not sure how they at Tufts refer to it, so Nancy will inform us. I just went this morning on the NSOLVE website to see who among our Tennessee Board of Regents schools has signed up to be involved in this study, which is free to us, and it provides incredibly valuable information on our students. Cleveland State is a registered member and is being studied. Pellissippi State is, and of the 4 years, MTSU's been involved with it. ETSU also is, and TSU. So for those of you from the other TBR institutions, and any other institution for that matter, if you're here from a private higher education institution, I have the contracts that you need your provost to sign in order to participate in this, and Nancy will illuminate what it will entail, but she will speak on the larger subject of diversity, civic education, democracy and politics, connecting currently disconnected learning goals. So if we're really able to go forward with this, knock for Micah, Dr. Thomas coming to us from the wilds of Canada. She's on vacation with her family, lucky her.
Good morning, and thank you so much for inviting me to this conference. I'm honored to be here and very sorry that I can't tour this beautiful, beautiful facility with you. I actually don't like doing what I'm doing, which is sort of, no pun intended, diving in and then diving out on a talk. I like to be there from start to finish, but I do appreciate you tolerating the fact that I was on vacation, and I'm really happy that we were able to work out the technology. If you're wondering where I am, I'm in absolute northern Ontario in the North Woods, and to get here this morning I had to take a little boat to a marina and then drive about 45 minutes to a computer shop, and they set me up, which was really nice, and so here we are. And I really can't hear you, so it's a little hard for me to know exactly if this is working. So if it's not, somebody needs to unmute and say, no, this is not working. So thank you, Mary, so much for the introduction and for inviting me. I'm very interested in Tennessee. We have 48 states represented in our voting study. Tennessee is one of them. We're starting to work with states, statewide coalitions, and Tennessee is one that I have an eye on. I think it's a very interesting state. We don't have enough campuses in the study just yet, but I think we can easily remedy that. And I can imagine some pretty rich multi-campus collaborations. As Mary indicated, I'm at the Institute of Democracy in Higher Education at Tufts University. Tufts is home of Tisch College of Civic Life, which is a kind of a unique structure. We have a dean who sits at the same table with the dean of the medical school, the engineering school, and so forth. We are responsible for educating Tufts students, but we also have a very robust research entity that studies a number of things. We have CIRCLE, which is the Center for Information and Learning on Civic Learning and Engagement, and they study K-12 and youth engagement more broadly. And then more recently, the Institute was formed to take a closer look at higher education. So we've got a very large national reach, and as I say, I'm really happy to be working with Tennessee today. I'm just going to talk very quickly about higher education's mission. I know that George Mahaffey and I believe Karen McTighe-Musil has spoken before me, so I'm just going to blow through it to provide a little bit of context. Then I'm going to talk very quickly about some of the data from the study on voting, and then quickly move into our qualitative case studies, because I imagine on day 2, you are very interested in trying to determine, well, what can we do? What can we do with this large responsibility and agenda that higher education has? And so I'm going to dive into what we're calling Politics 365, which is exactly what it sounds like, that we need to be talking politics 365 days a year. And then we'll open it up for questions. So as I'm sure most of you have heard already, higher education has a historic mission that I think is periodically recalibrated. From the early colleges, William and Mary and Harvard, of course, those colleges were designed to educate the moral and community leaders of the time. When the new republic was formed, in the 1776 era, Benjamin Franklin and Thomas Jefferson both formed universities because they felt that the universities would cultivate an educated and vigilant citizenry, foundational to a republic form of governance. So the whole idea that we needed K-12, these University of Virginia and University of Pennsylvania originally started out as lower level schools and then eventually morphed into universities. So the idea of having a public education in order to bolster the strength of American democracy is not a new idea. And then, of course, in the 1860s, the Morrill Act passed and we got our land-grant institutions in Tennessee, houses 2 of the very best of those. My point is that over time, higher education has had to recalibrate. It's had to take a look at its mission and adjust it to reflect the times. And one of my favorite quotes, and I have a hunch Karen might have mentioned this, comes from the Truman Commission, which was in 1947. As you know, the context for the Truman Commission was a reaction to the absolute horrors and insanity, really, of Nazi Germany. And this whole idea that we just should not have that kind of world crisis ever again. And so they created a commission to figure out what K-12 and higher ed could do. And it was identified that education's role is to educate students for their creative imagination and trained intelligence to the solution of social problems and to the administration of public affairs. And I think it is this solution of social problems and administration of public affairs that is a mission that has gotten a little bit lost over the last 60 years. Then, of course, we had the post-World War II rapid change, the rise of community colleges, the GI Bill, civil rights laws, Title IX, affirmative action cases, the expansion of all sorts of colleges, community colleges, and technical schools. And then eventually what we would call the civic movement. The civic movement started earlier, of course, and it has evolved over the years, but it really its most recent iteration started in the late 1990s in response to concerns over declining social capital. Americans would rather bowl alone than in leagues. And Tom Ehrlich published a very well-known book, Civic Responsibility in Higher Education, and sort of defined the movement as working to make a difference in the civic life of our communities and developing the combination of knowledge, skills, values, and motivation to actually make that difference. I think that these movements have all been critical to higher education. None of them should be lost. All of them are good. Every single one has been an improvement. The question is, where are we now? So in 2011, of course, the Crucible Moment report came out. I think you should know that at the same time, there were other reports. There was one by the U.S. Department of Education, and then also some really good work coming out of the American Democracy Project at ASCU, and 2 White House summits, one in 2014 and then another one that is coming up in 2016, all on what is the level of citizen participation in this country, what are we doing well, what is higher education, where does the work need to go. So right now, if you look at higher education's purpose, you'll see that it is, of course, to educate for 21st century careers. There are numbers to the, that are pretty staggering, that 76% of the jobs of the future will require a post-secondary degree. But we also are educating for personal well-being, social and economic equality, community engagement, going back to Tom Ehrlich's quote, and civic learning and democratic engagement. So what's the problem? Well, let's just take democratic engagement as an example. And this is where I want to turn briefly to our research, which is the National Study of Learning, Voting, and Engagement. Each campus opts into this study. It is not automatic and it is not a survey. It's really quite easy to do. And our objective is twofold. One is to provide campuses with good data. And so every campus that joins the study will receive a report that looks a little bit like the graph to the right of the screen. It is multiple pages, but this is the top line data. It will say whether your students were eligible to vote, how many registered, how many actually voted, and then it will provide a voting rate per institution. And we have that data right now for 2012 and 2014, but our larger purpose is to create a database for research. And at this point, we have almost 900 colleges and universities in the study, 48 states. We're now up to 8 million college student records, not 7.5. So our database probably has close to, sorry about the phone in the background, close to not quite half of the college students in the country. There are about 19 million in the country, but we're getting there. So why do I raise this? Because college students don't vote. And here's what we're seeing. The average voting rate for Americans, of course, is very, very low. I think in the Crucible Moment report, we were identified as one of the lowest of democracies in this world in terms of voting rate. About 62% of Americans vote in a presidential election, about 40% in a midterm election. And yet on college campuses, those numbers are even lower. 45% of college students vote of those 900 institutions in our study. And then if you look at the first-time eligible 18 to 21-year-olds, that number is lower. It's at 40%. Just for fun, I thought I would share with you that women vote at higher rates than men. And just a couple of other really interesting points that we're learning. Black students vote at significantly higher rates than white students, and the lowest voting rates are among Asian, Native, Hawaiian, and Pacific Islander students. And in terms of region, the Southeast is doing pretty well, 50%. I guess that's a relative term. I'm not sure it's so well, but it's better than New England, where I'm from, and better than Ohio, where I grew up. We don't have enough institutions in the study to provide Tennessee with statewide data at this point. Our policy is no fewer than 10 institutions. It's not that we're not willing to crunch the numbers, it's that these numbers are highly confidential, and we don't want any institution to be identified because of some kind of quantitative analysis that we've done. So once we have more campuses in the study, we can tell Tennessee more broadly what's happening, and we can break it down by public, private, institutional type, Carnegie classification, and a lot of other areas. One other thing that you should know is that there's a very high percentage of students who vote, and they are education majors, and our lowest voting rates are sadly among the STEM majors. Okay, so why did I bring up all this stuff about voting? Well, first of all, we have the study, we have the data, it's very interesting. But I will tell you that I don't think it's about voting. I don't think it's just about voting. I think that the problem is who votes. So right now, 80% of high-income Americans vote, and there are other studies out there that say it's over 90%, and if the income bracket is in the top, you know, the 0.00 Americans, then they vote at about 99%. 50% of low-income Americans vote. So what does that mean? That means that wealth disproportionately affects policy. And it's not, it's no one's fault that it disproportionately affects policy. The politicians know who reelects them. And so they are going to design policies for the people that reelect them. So students will often complain, our vote isn't heard, our voice isn't heard, we don't matter. Well, that's partly because they don't vote, and if they don't vote, they actually lose twice. Once, they don't get to choose their elected officials, and twice because nobody pays attention to them in between elections. Wealth inequality disproportionately affects particular populations. In 2014, the poverty rate for Black Americans was 27.2%, compared to a national average of 14.9 or 15%. And just so you know who gets elected, the median wealth for members of Congress in 2014 was 1.1 million, compared to 56,000 or so for the average American family in 2013. 90% of the nation's elected officials are white, and 71% are male. That means that 65% of elected officials are white male, and yet in the nation, 31% of the population is white male. So I'm not suggesting that certain groups can't do a good job representing Americans, but I am suggesting that if we hold up a mirror and we want a reflective democracy, a representative democracy, it's not what we have. So I think one thing I would like to add is that when we talk about educating for democracy, what we are talking about is, what we've done very well is we are educating for the problems in democracy. What we aren't doing is educating for the problems of democracy. That's a distinction that was drawn by David Matthews, who's the president of the Kettering Foundation. I think it's a very useful distinction. We have students going into communities and doing phenomenal work on the problems in democracy: poverty, homelessness, disparities in schools. But what we are not doing is educating all students to understand the problems of democracy. And I would identify those as, in part, representation, low levels of participation, inequality. I think we can all question whether students are adequately informed, or whether they are getting enough critical thinking skills so they can sort through all the junk that they hear. They can separate fact from fiction. And then, of course, the question, is our government actually functioning the way it should? These are the problems of democracy that I think we need to be paying attention to. So if I'm right and we need to recalibrate, I think there's a problem doing that. And the problem is, it's political. So educating for democracy, you know, it goes beyond this screen. It's really a big idea. It's amorphous. It's huge. And on college campuses, people don't even like to use the word political anymore. It's equated with partisan. Academics have been told over the last 30 years, you have to remain neutral. Well, maintaining neutrality ends up equating into avoidance. People are not talking about the difficult issues because they are so afraid that they will be accused of things like indoctrination. Political leaders, self-appointed watchdogs, parents, they all demand that academic decisions, such as the selection of all campus reads, be questioned, that they be a matter of public concern. And that makes balancing free expression and teaching a very difficult problem. You add to it the need to foster inclusive and equal environments, particularly for these new and historically marginalized groups of students, and it becomes a very, very complicated situation. So it's no wonder that we have shied away from educating for the problems of democracy and stuck with the relatively safe education for problems in democracy. So I want to turn now to our qualitative research, because I think this is where we can get pretty practical. As I say, we've got hundreds, almost 900 colleges and universities in the study. And with that, we've done some pretty interesting quantitative analysis to identify the indicators of voting. We then flip it, and we can calculate for each participating campus not only an actual voting rate, but a predicted voting rate. Now, the reason we do that is because we don't want to penalize institutions that bring in low propensity voters. So if your students are low propensity voters, it may be that they are certain demographic groups, that they are low income. We don't think that it's fair to say to a campus, well, you've got a high voting rate and therefore that is a measure of quality. It's not. It's a question of what is the value added given the student population that you serve. And so we can calculate a predicted voting rate. And based on that, we have identified campuses that are voting at rates significantly higher than predicted and significantly lower than predicted. And with those, we have 89 positive outliers, we call them, and about 94 negative outliers. With that information, we contacted 9 of those campuses and actually went to visit them. We visited 6 positives, 1 in the middle, and then 2 negatives. I would love to visit more negatives, but I have to tell you, it's pretty hard to call them up and say, hi, your voting rates are so low. We would love to poke around and find out why. Nobody wants to let us onto their campus, so I commend those campuses that did let us on, and I hope that more will, because what we're finding is just so interesting. All right, so we've developed a conceptual framework for this work. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on it, but I will say that we've got 4 frames. We're looking at 4 dimensions. The issue that we're looking at is campus climate, because we think that voting is a matter of a campus climate where political learning and engagement can happen. And it's not unlike some of the research on diversity, but we've developed our own conceptual framework based on our research. We're looking at 4 areas: the political, sort of what goes on, how are decisions made, what's going on in the state, is it a high contest state, is it a ballot initiative, are there lots of restrictions on voting, and then the structural, what's happening in the classroom, what kind of co-curricular things are going on. We found in the course of our study that physical spaces matter, and so we looked at the spatial side of a campus, and of course all sorts of things about people, behaviors, attitudes, and then finally what's happening historically at that institution. Is there a Kent State kind of incident? Are there symbols? Are there ways of being? All of this adds up to a campus climate that we are looking at, and from that we have identified some things that we think work. We call this Politics 365. There are five components to it. First of all, and I'm going to open this up for questions, so I'm going to try and go through it pretty quickly. The first thing that we're finding is that these campuses have very strong social cohesion. Now, what do we mean by that? Lots of strong interpersonal relationships, a culture of caring. Students would say to us, we talk about contentious issues all the time, and yet when we're done, we're still friends. Faculty members and students have deep relationships. This is something I can't emphasize enough. The faculty are critical to creating this strong sense of social cohesion. So what does this look like in reality? What would it look like on the ground? Well, for example, we've got one campus where very high voting rates, about 13 percentage points higher than predicted. It's a community college. It serves a very diverse population. It's in a sort of a lower middle class area of the country, in the Midwest. And at this campus, the faculty, several members of the faculty didn't feel like they were equipped to educate the students that they were serving. And they weren't getting a lot of support from the administration to figure out how to do it. So they took it upon themselves to create a small learning community, literally 3 faculty members, and study how to be agents of change. So they brought in groups to teach them the arts of facilitation, to teach them about diversity and perspective taking and inclusion, and creating inclusive environments in their classroom and also their offices. They then put a little sticker on their door saying, "We're a change agent." And what that did was it signaled to students that they could come in and talk to these faculty about things that they might not feel comfortable talking about. And over time, people walk by and say, "Well, what's that? What's that?" Since that program started, and I think it was about 6 years ago, it wasn't even a program, it was just an interest of some faculty. 85 faculty members have gone through the training. They have taken it upon themselves to train the trainers. In other words, they now are working in-house. And not one committee forms on campus where somebody doesn't say, "Okay, wait a minute, how many change agents are on this committee?" It has completely transformed the culture of this institution. On another campus, a very different place, a 4-year public branch campus in a southern state, also a very diverse student population, very, very poor students, economically disadvantaged students. And there, the faculty started paying attention to their students and learning that some of their students were sleeping in their cars. Some of the students didn't have diapers for their children. Some of the students didn't have food. And they decided that that was completely unacceptable, but they weren't sure how to catch those students. So they created a program, a hotline, a sort of a culture of caring hotline. And in orientation, they teach every single student, you are responsible for your neighbor. You're responsible for their learning, their well-being, and their success here at this institution. They now have food banks, they have dormitory rooms that are set aside for homeless students. They have all sorts of things. I suspect many of your campuses do this as well, but it's part of the campus climate. It creates a strong undertone of social cohesion and networks. And then finally, just briefly, they have very strong habits of collaboration. The other thing that these institutions do very well is they have what is truly collaborative, not shared governance. Shared governance, we all know, is sort of faculty administrators working together. Collaborative governance is something totally different. It involves students, it involves staff members that might not ordinarily be involved in governance and decision making. Students have a lot of power. On one of our institutions that we visited, the students actually own a building. And the building has many of the core functions, such as the cafeteria, the bookstore, the student union, office spaces and classroom spaces. The students run it through the student government, and 450 students work in that building every single semester. I believe that the student government actually has title to the building. Another thing that happens on these campuses that we're just seeing more and more of, which is really exciting to me, is clubs and societies taking a very robust role on campus. So bear in mind that students who have lots of family obligations, many children, a couple of jobs, they don't have time to join some of the more social things such as fraternities and sororities. And instead, these institutions have created opportunities for the students to work with faculty through the chemistry club or the engineering society. And in these structures, they actually share responsibility for governance in the department, but they also talk a lot about political issues. They do a lot of student activism. The chemistry club, for example, on one of our campuses does a blood drive. This is turning out to be a pretty invisible but powerful structure on campuses. The next thing we're finding is lots and lots of pervasive political conversations. I cannot emphasize this enough. This happened at all of the campuses that we visited that were positive outliers. A tremendous amount of respect for free speech, dissenting points of view, inclusion, intentionally designed opportunities inside and outside of the classroom to talk about social identity, political ideology, lived experiences. There was a clear understanding at these campuses that where people are from affects how they learn, and that these conversations are political. They just are. Conversations about race are political. Conversations about religion are political. You cannot avoid it, so learn to do it well. These are institutions that do it really well. One of the ways that they do it is they embed it in core curricula for the students. And they don't make it, here's a course on political discussion. They embed it in, for example, 2 of the campuses embedded in a composition class, a required composition class where the students learn to write, but they also learn to analyze, frame, discuss, debate, and then write about issues all of political consequence. Some of the institutions have centers or institutes for public deliberation or some kind of version of that. I'm almost done here with these 5 things, and then I'll open it up to questions. The 4th one is diversity and equity as a deliberate practice. This is compositional diversity, relational diversity. As I've already said, really taking the time to learn someone's social perspective. This is very important. One campus has an empowerment party. The students run it. Again, going back to the other example I gave of the faculty that took it upon themselves to learn how to be inclusive, that was a very intentional act that had staying power on the campuses. We do have one campus we visited that didn't have compositional diversity. And in that case, what they did is they brought in a lot of controversial speakers. They brought in a lot of diverse perspectives in the classroom. They're constantly, the faculty are always asking, what is the perspective not in the room? Take the position of somebody who isn't here. Go out and form an argument for the people who are not represented here. So a lot of intentional learning experiences to bring matters of diversity and equity into the conversation. And underlying all of this are these norms of free speech, openness, attention to the dissenting perspective. And then finally, yes, active political engagement. One of the campuses, which it is up on our website if you want to learn more about this, they do something called Walk to Vote. These places are abuzz during an election season. Not all of them, but some of them had very, very robust student organizations that created opportunities. My favorite story has to do with a campus where the student government leaders come to campus every day wearing a suit, or for the guys, a suit and tie. And they do that because they are so politically connected. The student government is so politically connected that they never know when they're going to have to call the media or call a politician and say, there's something happening here, you want to be a part of it, come on down, and then there's a photo op. The administration stays out of their way. These students have a direct line to the politicians and to the media. So one of my favorite ones is when Nelson Mandela was dying, the students decided to have a candlelight vigil. They bought a lot of candles and they opened it up on the patio and near the main building. And they called the media and they said, we're having a candlelight vigil. A lot of politicians are here. And then they called the politicians and said, we're having a candlelight vigil. Come hold a candle because the media is going to be here. The students managed to get all these people together, and there they were in the middle with their suits on. It was really quite amazing. On another campus, protests are a regular practice, and the administration does not dodge them. We were actually on one campus when a protest erupted, and the students, the president came out of his office, came downstairs, spent a couple of hours with the students asking what was going on. They talked about it, resolved it, and the protest stopped. So our vision is that we are going to be working toward a democracy that's participatory, equitable and representational, educated and informed, and effectively governed. And this means we have to have conversations about race, we have to have conversations about religion, and we need to figure out these divides in our country between the red and the blue, between the rural and the urban. We just have to figure it out. And it's the best place to do that right now is on a college campus. So with that, I'm going to stop, open it up. Just ignore the instructions on the top. I was going to have you talk together for 5 minutes, but I'm not sure we have time. But why don't we open it up for questions? And if anyone wants to talk about anything, let me know. And Mary, if you think we have time, everybody could take a few minutes to talk amongst themselves.
Let's start with the most obvious piece, which is, does anyone have a direct question for Nancy? She can actually hear us, and I believe, if I'm correct, she can see us, but the camera for her is down there. Anyone? Well, I have a question, Nancy. You used the phrase low propensity voters. I understand what you're implying by that, but it's the propensity to vote, or are there other pieces of that I'm sort of intuiting, but it's not being explicit?
First of all, I don't think when I say low propensity voters, I'm not talking about people who are not motivated. I'm talking about people who fall into categories of low voters. So, for example, women vote at much higher voting rates than men. So if we were doing our regression, we would be factoring in women as a plus, meaning they're high propensity voters, or men as a minus because they are relatively or comparatively low propensity voters. And so that's what I mean by that.
All right. Anyone else have a question for Nancy? What's your query for us here as a group? What would you ask us to do? See how much time it might take.
What would I ask you to do?
Yeah, when you were saying you would like us to sort of interact with each other.
I think you should, what I would love if we had time is you take a look at this list of 5 things and identify one where you either have a question or a concern or even a promising practice that you think would help others implement some changes on their campuses.
Maybe it's if you could maybe grab a phone snap of that, maybe that's the kind of thing we can bring to our discussions later in the day and as we go through the day. Might be a very smart thing to do.
Okay, I'll introduce myself. I'm Vivian Gladson, and I'm from Walter State Community College, which is in the far east side of Tennessee. Okay, I've got Northeast State over here. All right, so anyway, one of the things that I do in my sociology class is I always make it a point of asking students if they're registered to vote. And I have so many students that say, no, and why should I even bother to register because they keep voting in the same people over and over and over. And it is true, they keep voting the same people over, but I tell them that the only way that we can make those changes is if they become part of making that change. And I encourage them, I bring in applications for them to vote, but I told them my own story, which I was a young Hispanic girl from San Antonio, and I could not wait to register to vote. And I have voted every single year of my life. And I haven't gotten everything that I wanted to do, but I still vote. I don't sit in the back and just complain about that. How do you address the college students today that, you know, those that you are able to talk to, and maybe even in the audience, you know, to try to turn these students around and try to get them to understand that it's really important to be part of the voting process? Thank you.
Yeah, I second that. I think one of the things that we found that's sort of cutting across all 5 of these attributes of these politically engaged campuses is that students are empowered. They're empowered through conversations. They're empowered through governance at the institution. They're empowered because they can talk to the media or they can talk to politicians. And what I think students complain about today is a lack of power. They say, we don't have a voice. Nobody is paying attention to us. Now, it's a self-fulfilled prophecy. If you don't vote, nobody's paying attention to you. And so you've got to kind of figure out how to break that cycle. But on many campuses that we visited, the students said, we started small. We realized that we could actually affect each other's learning in a classroom. I could help my peer succeed. And from that, I talked to my professor, and I learned how to talk to my professor. And from there, I talked to the president, and from there, the chancellor, and from there, a politician. So it is a building process. Now, one thing you should know is that our research suggests that confidence levels for men go up in college, and confidence levels for women go down. And confidence levels for people of color go down even more. So that's an interesting and difficult problem. So if you're going to empower students, you almost have to empower them unequally in order to level the playing field. But I think a lot of it is empowerment. The other thing that I do, I have a really cool slide that I'd be happy to share with you. It's a picture of a billboard on the side of a highway in LA, like 8 lanes, bumper to bumper, dead standstill. And it says, don't blame the traffic, you are the traffic. This is what I tell students. You can blame the system, but you live in a democracy. You are the system. Now, is it rigged right now? Is there too much money in politics? Yes, there are lots and lots of problems, which is why one of our last things is it needs to be effectively governed, but we're not going to have effective government unless the students step up.
Thank you so much to Dr. Nancy Thomas for starting her day on a very straightforward challenge to us to be more overtly free and open to discuss politics that's not partisan, that has to do with governance and students' empowerment and their engagement.